The morning light filtered through the towering sycamores, casting a soft glow over the sleepy town of Maplewood Hills. For years, this neighborhood had been a haven of quiet routines and familiar faces, where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes down cobblestone streets, neighbors exchanged smiles over garden fences, and the hum of lawnmowers provided the soundtrack to warm Saturday afternoons. Today, though, change had arrived. The Garcia family, a young couple with two spirited boys, had moved into the corner house, a quaint, ivy-covered cottage that had been vacant for months. Alejandro Garcia, a tall, soft-spoken man with a kind smile, stood on the porch with his wife, Sophia, unpacking boxes while their sons darted around the yard, laughing and chasing each other with foam swords. To the Garcias, this move marked a new chapter. Alejandro had just been promoted to assistant principal at the local high school, a role he took on with pride and humility. Sophia, a freelance graphic designer, had spent hours poring over Pinterest boards to imagine how she'd transform the house into a cozy sanctuary. The boys, Diego and Mateo, were thrilled about the big yard where they could finally play soccer. But as the Garcias set up their new life, an unseen tension brewed across the street. Behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges, Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, Maplewood's self-proclaimed historian and gatekeeper, watched through her lace curtains with pursed lips and narrowed eyes. Eleanor had lived on this street for 45 years, long enough to remember when every face looked just like hers. She'd seen changes over the years, some good, some not so much in her opinion. And now, seeing the Garcias move in, she couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about them felt different. Eleanor didn't know Alejandro or Sophia. She didn't know that they volunteered at community events, that Alejandro had mentored dozens of struggling students, or that Sophia's artwork had been featured in local galleries. She didn't know that Diego loved science experiments, or that Mateo dreamed of being a professional soccer player. All Eleanor saw was a family who didn't fit into the picture she'd carefully curated of Maplewood Hills. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor's suspicions simmered. She wasn't one for confrontation, but she also wasn't one to let things slide. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen, debating whether to call the neighborhood association. After all, wasn't it her duty to maintain the peace? On the other side of the hedge, oblivious to the brewing storm, Alejandro and Sophia paused their unpacking to share a quiet moment. Alejandro wrapped an arm around Sophia's shoulders, his gaze sweeping over their new home. "We made it," he said softly, the weight of years of hard work and sacrifice evident in his voice. Sophia smiled, leaning into him. "We did. This is at Ale. This is home." For the Garcias, the move to Maplewood Hills was a dream come true. For Eleanor Bishop, it was the beginning of a disruption she hadn't asked for. And for the rest of the neighborhood, it was the start of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about community, belonging, and the ties that bind us all. The air smelled faintly of fresh pastries and roasted coffee as the bells above the door jingled, announcing another arrival to Maxwell's Corner Cafe, a small-town staple nestled on the tree-lined main street of Oakwood Springs. The cafe was an unassuming hub where regulars nursed steaming mugs over morning newspapers, and the occasional newcomer sparked whispers about who they were and why they'd wandered in. This morning, nestled at a booth in the far corner, Elijah Barrett flipped through his tablet, scrolling past notifications and emails with the kind of calm precision he brought to every part of his life. At 44, Elijah was one of the youngest CEOs of a Fortune 500 company, a name spoken with admiration in boardrooms and cited as a trailblazer in think pieces. But here, in this unassuming cafe miles from the skyscrapers of Chicago, no one seemed to notice or care who he was. And Elijah liked it that way. Dressed in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, with tortoiseshell glasses perched on his nose, he could have been mistaken for any other patron. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. His humility was born from experience, a life filled with lessons about the weight of perception and the armor of resilience. From his early days growing up on the south side of Chicago to his meteoric rise in the corporate world, Elijah had learned that modesty was a tool as much as it was a virtue. It disarmed people, made them underestimate him. And in his world, being underestimated was a superpower. The cafe hummed with quiet activity. The hiss of the espresso machine underscored snippets of conversation. A young couple debating vacation plans, a construction worker scrolling through his phone, a barista wiping down the counter while chatting with a regular. Outside, the street bustled with life, the rhythm of small-town simplicity. Elijah found himself momentarily distracted by the view. A mother guiding her toddler across the crosswalk, an elderly man adjusting his hat against the morning breeze. "Excuse me?" The voice drew Elijah's attention back to the present. A young server stood by his table, holding a pot of coffee. Her name tag read Amelia. She was perhaps 20, with bright eyes and a nervous energy that suggested this was her first job. "Would you like a refill?" Elijah smiled warmly and gestured to his nearly empty cup. "That would be great, thanks." As Amelia poured, her eyes flicked briefly to the tablet on the table. She hesitated, then asked, "Are you working on something important?" Elijah chuckled, sensing her curiosity. "Just catching up on emails. Nothing too exciting." Amelia smiled back, seemingly reassured. "Well, if you need anything, just holler." "I will." "Thanks, Amelia," he said, noting her name tag. Her surprise at hearing her name was almost comical. She clearly wasn't used to patrons paying that much attention. As she walked away, Elijah returned to his tablet, but his focus was broken. Something about this place tugged at him. It wasn't the coffee, though it was surprisingly good, or the ambience, which he found charming in its simplicity. It was the people. Oakwood Springs was a world apart from the high-stakes corporate boardrooms and luxury penthouses that defined so much of his life. Yet beneath the surface of its small-town charm, there were cracks, small, subtle hints of something else. The way some conversations hushed when he walked by. The way curious glances lingered just a beat too long. He'd come to Oakwood Springs to finalize a land deal, a significant one that would bring new jobs and development to the area. His company's investment would inject millions into the local economy, and he was optimistic about the project. But this wasn't his first time navigating spaces where people like him were unexpected, where his presence was questioned before he even opened his mouth. Elijah had faced prejudice in countless forms, from boardroom microaggressions to outright hostility in his early career. He'd learned to wear his success as both a shield and a statement. But here, sitting quietly in Maxwell's, he couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was more significant than the deal he was brokering. In places like this, where traditions ran deep and change was met with suspicion, the weight of his identity loomed large, whether he acknowledged it or not. "Morning, Elijah." Elijah." The cheerful voice belonged to George Lansing, the local real estate agent who had facilitated the land purchase. George was a wiry man in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a disarming grin that managed to be both sincere and calculating. He slid into the booth across from Elijah without waiting for an invitation, his portfolio tucked under one arm and a to-go coffee cup in the other. "Good to see you, George," Elijah greeted, closing his tablet and leaning back slightly. "You're up early." George laughed, the kind of hearty laugh that filled a room whether it was welcome or not. "Early bird gets the worm, right? And in this case, gets the signatures." He patted the portfolio as if it were a treasure chest. Elijah smiled politely. "I appreciate you arranging this meeting. The deal's important to me." George's grin widened, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt or discomfort that Elijah had seen countless times. It wasn't hostility, not exactly. It was the look of someone trying to reconcile the image of a powerful CEO with the person sitting in front of them. "Well," George said, clearing his throat, "you know how folks around here are. They'll warm up to the idea eventually. Change is hard for people in small towns, but once they see the benefits, jobs, new business, it'll all make sense." "Of course," Elijah replied, his voice even. "Change always comes with challenges." Before George could respond, a voice from a nearby table cut through the air. "More like challenges come with outsiders trying to change things." Elijah turned slightly, his gaze falling on an older man seated 2 tables away. He was burly, with a weathered face and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen decades of labor. He stared directly at Elijah, his expression unreadable, but his tone unmistakable. George shifted uncomfortably, his smile faltering. "Now, Hank, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Mr. Barrett here is doing this town a favor. Is he?" Hank interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Or is he just another city type coming in to make a buck and leave us to deal with the mess?" The cafe grew quiet. Even the barista behind the counter froze mid-motion, her eyes darting between Hank and Elijah. It wasn't the first time Elijah had been in a situation like this. He could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze, the unspoken tension hanging thick in the air. Elijah took a slow sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate calm. He met Hank's gaze directly, his voice measured. "I understand your concerns. I'd feel the same way if I were in your shoes. But my goal isn't to take anything from this town. It's to invest in its future." Hank snorted, leaning back in his chair. "That's what they all say. Then they build their factories, cut their ribbons, and leave us with broken promises." Elijah nodded thoughtfully, refusing to take the bait. "I can't speak for others, but I can promise you this. I don't make empty promises. My team and I are committed to this project and to this community." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hank stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. He glanced at Elijah one last time before walking out, muttering something under his breath that Elijah didn't bother to decipher. George exhaled loudly, breaking the silence. "Don't mind Hank. He's a stubborn old coot, stuck in his ways." Elijah offered a faint smile, but said nothing. The encounter had been brief, but it carried the weight of something much larger, a storm brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful town. As the cafe slowly returned to its usual buzz, Elijah glanced out the window, his thoughts turning to the work ahead. This wasn't just a land deal anymore. It was a battle for trust, respect, and belonging. And Elijah Barrett had never been one to back down from a fight. The day's warmth gave way to a crisp afternoon as Elijah stepped out of Maxwell's Corner Cafe, his leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. He stood for a moment on the cobblestone sidewalk, the quiet hum of small-town life enveloping him. Across the street, a group of children ran past a hardware store, their laughter ringing out as their parents called after them. Elijah allowed himself a brief smile, soaking in the simplicity of the moment. But the confrontation with Hank lingered. It wasn't the man's words that stuck with him, those he'd heard in one form or another countless times. No, it was the silence that followed. The way the cafe had paused, its patrons holding their collective breath, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. He'd seen it before, the fear of conflict, the comfort of inaction. It was a quiet reminder of how much work was still left to do, not just for this project, but for people like him everywhere. As Elijah turned toward his parked car, a sleek black sedan that seemed out of place among the more modest vehicles lining the street, he noticed a patrol car idling near the curb. Its engine rumbled softly, the officer inside glancing his way. Elijah ignored the stare and unlocked his car, sliding into the driver's seat. He'd learned long ago not to feed into suspicion with unnecessary movements or reactions. Yet as he adjusted his mirror, the patrol car pulled away from the curb, trailing him as he eased onto the main road. Elijah sighed, keeping his speed just below the limit, his grip tightening on the wheel. He told himself it was coincidence, just another officer doing their rounds. But the feeling was too familiar, the weight of eyes scrutinizing him for reasons they wouldn't admit aloud. A mile out of town, the flashing lights erupted behind him, their red and blue pulses casting long shadows over the empty road. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he immediately pulled to the shoulder, his hands coming to rest on the wheel in plain sight. He'd rehearsed this moment too many times to count. The officer approached slowly, hand resting on his holster. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the afternoon sun, making it impossible to read his expression. Elijah rolled down the window and looked up, his face neutral but firm. "Afternoon, officer," Elijah said evenly. "Is there a problem?" The officer tilted his head slightly, studying Elijah for a beat too long. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped. Elijah nodded, moving deliberately to retrieve his wallet and the documents from his glove compartment. He handed them over without a word, watching as the officer inspected them with exaggerated care. "Nice car," the officer remarked, his tone shifting slightly. "You in town for business, or?" The pause was deliberate, the implication hanging in the air. "Business," Elijah replied, keeping his voice calm. "I'm working on a development project in Oakwood Springs." The officer arched an eyebrow. "Development project, huh? What kind of business you in?" Elijah met his gaze, his patience wearing thin. "I'm the CEO of Barrett Industries. We specialize in sustainable infrastructure. I'm here to finalize a land deal." The officer's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. "Ah, wait here." As the officer returned to his patrol car, Elijah leaned back against the headrest, willing himself to stay calm. This wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising, but it didn't make it less infuriating. He thought of the emails still waiting for his attention, the meetings he'd prepared for, the family calls he'd planned to squeeze in before dinner. All of it delayed because someone had decided he didn't belong on this road, in this car, in this town. Minutes ticked by, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Elijah resisted the urge to glance in his rearview mirror, knowing it would only feed into whatever narrative the officer was spinning in his mind. Finally, the officer returned, his face unreadable. "Everything checks out," he said, handing back the documents. "Just wanted to make sure you were who you said you were." Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing against the leather of his steering wheel. "Is there anything else, officer?" The man hesitated, as if searching for something to say. Then, with a curt nod, he stepped back. "Drive safe." Elijah didn't respond, instead rolling up his window and pulling back onto the road. His heart pounded harder than he liked to admit, anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. He replayed the encounter in his mind, dissecting every word, every gesture, every second of wasted time. It was exhausting, this constant need to validate his existence to people who hadn't earned the right to question it. By the time Elijah arrived at the real estate office for his meeting, his frustration had subsided but not disappeared. He straightened his sweater and entered the building, greeted by a chipper receptionist who directed him to a conference room. Inside, George Lansing was already seated, flipping through a stack of papers. Across from him sat two town officials, both middle-aged men in crisp suits who looked up as Elijah entered. Their expressions were polite but guarded, the kind of neutrality that often masked discomfort. "Elijah!" George exclaimed, rising to shake his hand. "Glad you could make it." "Good to be here," Elijah replied, his tone measured. He exchanged introductions with the officials, Robert, the town planner, and Frank, a senior councilman, before taking a seat. The meeting began with pleasantries, George leading the conversation with practiced ease. But as they delved into the specifics of the land deal, Elijah noticed the subtle shifts. Robert's questions, while technically valid, carried an edge of skepticism. Frank's interjections often veered into tangential concerns about preserving the character of the town. "It's not that we're against development," Frank said at one point, leaning back in his chair. "But we have to be careful about who we let invest in our community. We've had situations in the past where promises were made, and well, let's just say the follow-through wasn't there." Elijah nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I understand your concerns. That's why we've outlined specific milestones and accountability measures in the proposal. My team is committed to transparency." Frank exchanged a glance with Robert, who cleared his throat. "It's just you understand how these things look to a small town like ours. A company like yours, it's big, it's out of place here." Elijah resisted the urge to bristle. "What exactly do you mean by out of place?" Robert hesitated, fumbling for words. "I mean, we're not used to corporations coming in with such large-scale plans. It's a lot for people to wrap their heads around." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Barrett Industries isn't just any corporation. We've worked with communities across the country, tailoring our projects to their specific needs. My team has already engaged with local businesses and leaders to ensure that this development benefits Oakwood Springs without compromising its identity." The room fell silent, the weight of Elijah's words settling over the table. George cleared his throat, breaking the tension. I think what Mr. Barrett is saying is that this project is a partnership, not a takeover. Frank offered a thin smile, but the unease in his posture remained. Elijah could feel the resistance in the room, unspoken but palpable. It wasn't just about the project. It was about him, his presence, his authority, his refusal to shrink under their scrutiny. The meeting ended on a polite but unresolved note, the officials promising to review the details before making a final decision. Elijah shook hands with each of them, their grips firm but distant, and watched as they filed out of the room. "You handled that well," George said, clapping him on the shoulder. "They're tough nuts to crack, but they'll come around." Elijah smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." Back in his car, Elijah allowed himself a moment of reflection. The road ahead was clear, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He knew this battle wasn't about zoning laws or economic forecasts. It was about perception, about proving his worth in a place that saw him as an outsider before they saw him as a person. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a room full of doubters. It wouldn't be the last. But Elijah Barrett had built a life on defying expectations, and he wasn't about to stop now. The courthouse steps were steep and unforgiving, bathed in the harsh afternoon sun that bleached the white stone and cast long shadows over Oakwood Springs. Elijah adjusted his tie as he approached, the murmur of a small but vocal crowd rising to meet him. Reporters and locals had gathered, their curiosity stoked by whispers of the town council's contentious land deal. A handful of picket signs peppered the crowd, slogans scrawled in bold letters, "Protect our town," and "No outsiders." Elijah kept his stride measured, his expression calm. He had faced worse, far worse. But as he approached the courthouse doors, a shout rose from the crowd. "You don't belong here, Barrett." The voice was deep and sharp, cutting through the clamor like a blade. Elijah paused for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the source. Hank, the burly man from Maxwell's, standing with a small group of men who wore the same defiant scowls. Their presence wasn't surprising. Hank had made his disdain clear from the beginning. But this time, he wasn't just an isolated voice. He was part of something larger, something angrier. "Elijah," called a voice from behind. It was George Lansing, weaving his way through the crowd, his tie slightly askew. His smile was strained, his usual easy confidence faltering under the weight of the growing tension. "You ready for this?" he asked, lowering his voice as he reached Elijah. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elijah replied, his tone steady. He glanced at the courthouse doors, the ornate carvings on the heavy wood suddenly feeling like a barrier rather than an entryway. "Let's get this over with." Inside, the air was cooler, but no less charged. The council chamber was packed, the wooden benches filled with townspeople, reporters, and a few familiar faces. Clara, the retired teacher who had voiced her support early on, offered Elijah a small nod as he entered. But her presence was a flicker of warmth in an otherwise frosty room. Seated at the head of the chamber was Judge Marion Hensley, a stern woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was tempered by her adherence to tradition. To her left sat Robert and Frank, the town officials who had grilled Elijah during the last meeting. To her right was Officer Daniels, the same officer who had pulled Elijah over days earlier. His presence felt deliberate, a silent reminder of the power dynamics at play. Elijah took his seat at the long table near the front, George settling beside him with a stack of neatly organized documents. Across from them sat Hank, flanked by two other men Elijah didn't recognize. Their expressions were hard, their stances confrontational. "Let's begin," Judge Hensley said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're here today to discuss the proposed development project by Barrett Industries. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor." Elijah rose, buttoning his suit jacket as he addressed the room. His voice was calm but firm, each word measured to convey authority without arrogance. He spoke about the project's potential to revitalize Oakwood Springs, about the jobs it would create and the community partnerships his company had already established. He laid out the safeguards, the accountability measures, the long-term benefits. But as he spoke, He could feel the weight of the room pressing against him. The disapproving stares, the whispered conversations, the barely veiled skepticism. He had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this, but even he couldn't ignore the simmering hostility. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before Hank stood, his broad shoulders blocking the light from a nearby window. His voice was low and deliberate, each word dripping with disdain. "That's a nice speech, Mr. Barrett," Hank said, his eyes narrowing. "But we've heard speeches before. And you know what happens? The promises dry up, the money disappears, and we're left to clean up the mess. Why should we trust you?" Elijah met Hank's gaze, his posture unyielding. "Because my track record speaks for itself. Every community we've worked with has seen tangible benefits. I'm not here to exploit Oakwood Springs. I'm here to invest in its future." Hank snorted, crossing his arms. "Invest, huh? Is that what you call it when you bulldoze local businesses and bring in outsiders to take over? You don't care about this town. You care about your bottom line." "That's enough, Mr. Dalton," Judge Hensley interjected, though her tone lacked conviction. "This isn't a trial." Hank's lips curled into a smirk, but he sat down, his point made. Elijah could feel the ripple of agreement passing through the room, the unspoken biases validating Hank's accusations. George leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm. This is just posturing." Before Elijah could respond, Officer Daniels cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I think it's worth noting that Mr. Barrett's conduct in this town hasn't exactly been above reproach." Elijah turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" Daniels leaned back in his chair, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There was an incident earlier this week. A traffic stop. Mr. Barrett was less than cooperative." "That's a lie," Elijah said, his voice steady but cold. "I complied with every request you made." Daniel shrugged. "That's not how I remember it." The murmurs in the room grew louder, the tide of doubt swelling once again. Elijah felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay composed. Losing his temper now would only give them ammunition. "Your Honor," Elijah said, addressing Judge Hensley directly, "if Officer Daniels has concerns about my character, he's welcome to provide evidence. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if we could focus on the matter at hand." Judge Hensley's gaze flicked between Elijah and Daniels before she nodded. "Agreed. Let's keep this relevant." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken judgments. Elijah could feel the walls closing in, the weight of systemic prejudice bearing down on him. He had come prepared to defend his project, but now it felt like he was defending his very right to exist in this space. The meeting dragged on, each question and comment laced with thinly veiled hostility. By the time it adjourned, Elijah felt like he had run a marathon. As he stepped outside, the crowd from earlier had grown larger, their chants and jeers echoing down the street. "Elijah!" George called, hurrying to catch up. "Don't let them get to you. This is how these things go. Small towns, big egos." Elijah turned to George, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about egos, George. It's about control, and they don't want to lose it." Before George could respond, a commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. Two police officers were speaking to a young black man who looked barely out of his teens. The boy's hands were raised, his face pale with fear, while one officer gripped his arm. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, stepping toward the scene. George grabbed his arm. "Elijah, don't." But Elijah was already moving, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What's the issue here, officer?" The officer turned, his grip tightening on the boy's arm. "Stay back, sir. This doesn't concern you." "It does if you're detaining him without cause," Elijah said, his tone firm but measured. He glanced at the boy. "What's your name?" "Dante," the boy stammered. Elijah turned back to the officer. "Is Dante under arrest?" The officer hesitated, his posture stiffening. He was loitering near private property. "We're just having a conversation." Elijah crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "It doesn't look like a conversation to me. Let him go." The officer's jaw tightened, but after a tense moment, he released Dante's arm. "Just stay out of trouble, kid," he muttered before walking away. As the crowd dispersed, Dante turned to Elijah, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I I didn't do anything. I know, Elijah said softly, his chest tightening. He watched as Dante hurried away, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. And what could have happened? He turned back to George, his expression hard. This isn't just a land deal anymore. It's a fight for something bigger. George nodded, his face pale. What are you going to do? Elijah looked back at the courthouse, the picket signs, the faces of people who doubted him simply for being there. I'm going to make them see me for who I am, whether they like it or not. Elijah stood at the edge of the courthouse lawn, his jaw tight as the crowd's energy grew more volatile. What had started as a murmur of discontent had erupted into a cacophony of shouts, with more signs appearing in the sea of faces. Say no to outsiders. Protect our heritage. Each slogan stung, a reminder that his every step in this town was under scrutiny. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford distractions now. The scene with Dante had left his heart racing, but he kept his expression calm, even as he replayed the interaction in his mind. That could have gone very differently, and he knew it. If Elijah hadn't intervened, Dante might have ended the day in a jail cell, or worse. Elijah. George's voice pulled him back to the present. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. I'm telling you, this isn't worth it. Let the council deliberate. Walk away for now. Elijah turned to him, his eyes sharp. Walk away? That's exactly what they want. If I leave, it validates everything they've been saying, that I don't belong here, that I'm just another outsider swooping in for profit. George hesitated, looking around at the crowd. I know it feels personal, but you've got to think strategically. You can't change their minds in one day. No, Elijah said quietly, his voice resolute. But I can show them who I really am. And if that makes them uncomfortable, so be it. Before George could respond, Officer Daniels emerged from the crowd, his expression unreadable, but his presence deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, one hand resting on the radio clipped to his chest. Mr. Barrett, Daniels said, his voice carrying over the noise. A word. Elijah straightened, meeting Daniels' gaze. He could feel the crowd watching, their whispers a low hum of anticipation. What can I do for you, officer? Daniels gestured toward the patrol car parked near the curb. Would you mind coming with me? There are some questions we need to clear up. Elijah's brow furrowed. Questions about what? Daniels smirked, the expression small but unmistakable. We've received a report about suspicious activity linked to your vehicle. It's probably nothing, but we need to check it out. Elijah felt a flicker of anger, but he kept his composure. He knew what this was, another attempt to undermine him, to cast doubt on his intentions. He glanced at George, whose face was a mixture of confusion and alarm. This is ridiculous, George said, stepping forward. Elijah's been with me all morning. There's no way. Daniels held up a hand, cutting him off. This is standard procedure, Mr. Lansing. If Mr. Barrett has nothing to hide, this won't take long. Elijah exhaled slowly, weighing his options. Refusing would escalate the situation, and that was exactly what Daniels wanted. But compliance came with its own risks, risks he had faced too many times before. Fine, Elijah said, his voice steady. Let's get this over with. The patrol car was cramped, the air inside stifling despite the air conditioning. Daniels didn't speak as he drove, his silence more pointed than words. Elijah sat in the back seat, his fists clenched in his lap, his mind racing. Where were they going? What was the endgame here? The car finally pulled into the police station, a squat brick building with barred windows that seemed to loom over the small parking lot. Daniels parked and stepped out, opening the back door for Elijah. This way, he said, gesturing toward the station's entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. Officers moved briskly through the halls, their expressions detached. Daniels led Elijah to a small interrogation room, its gray walls bare except for a clock that ticked loudly in the silence. Wait here, Daniels said before disappearing down the hall. Elijah sat at the metal table, his frustration mounting. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an attempt to humiliate him, to paint him as a threat. He thought of the crowd outside the courthouse, the council members in their chambers, Dante on the street. How many others had been in this room, subjected to the same tactics? The door opened, and Daniels returned, a file folder in hand. He sat across from Elijah, placing the folder on the table with deliberate slowness. "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Barrett?" Daniels asked, leaning back in his chair. "You tell me," Elijah replied, his voice calm but sharp. "You said something about suspicious activity. What exactly am I being accused of?" Daniels opened the folder, revealing a series of papers that Elijah couldn't make out from his angle. "We've had some reports about your company's dealings in Oakwood Springs. Concerns about financial irregularities, zoning violations, that sort of thing." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "And these reports conveniently surfaced after I started making progress on the land deal?" Daniel shrugged, his smirk returning. "Could be a coincidence. Could be something more." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Let me make something clear, officer. My company operates with the highest standards of integrity. If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not going to work." Daniels chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "Intimidate you? No, Mr. Barrett. I'm just doing my job." Before Elijah could respond, the door opened again, and another figure entered the room. It was Mitchell, the town's deputy police chief, a man with a reputation for being more reasonable than his counterparts. He looked between Daniels and Elijah, his expression unreadable. "Daniels," Mitchell said, his tone firm. "I'll take it from here." Daniels hesitated, his smirk faltering. "Chief, I said I'll take it from here," Mitchell repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Daniels stood, his jaw tight, and left the room without another word. Mitchell closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Elijah. "Mr. Barrett," Mitchell began, his tone measured, "I want to apologize for the way this has been handled. Daniels has a particular approach, and it's not one I endorse." Elijah studied Mitchell, trying to gauge his sincerity. "And what exactly is your approach, Chief?" Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I know what's going on here. You're trying to do something good for this town, and not everyone is ready to accept it. But you've made some enemies along the way, and they're not playing fair." "Enemies?" Elijah asked, his tone skeptical. "Or just people who don't like seeing someone like me in a position of power?" Mitchell didn't flinch. "Probably a bit of both." Elijah exhaled, his frustration giving way to a steely resolve. "So what happens now?" Mitchell hesitated, then leaned forward. "I'll make sure this nonsense with Daniels doesn't go any further. But you need to understand something. Oakwood Springs is a small town, and change doesn't come easy here. If you're going to fight this fight, you need to be prepared for a long battle." Elijah met Mitchell's gaze, his voice steady. "I've been fighting my whole life, Chief. This town isn't going to break me." Mitchell nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his face. "Then I suggest you get back to the courthouse. They're waiting for you." As Elijah stepped back into the sunlight, the crowd outside the courthouse had grown even larger. The chants were louder, the signs more pointed. But Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his project. He was fighting for his dignity, his place, and the countless others who would never have the chance to stand where he was. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, the noise swelling around him. The stakes had never been higher, but Elijah Barrett had never been more ready. Elijah Barrett stood at the foot of the courthouse steps, his heart steady but his resolve like tempered steel. The crowd had swelled, their chants rising and falling in waves. The signs accusing him of greed and dishonesty bobbed in a sea of faces. He scanned the crowd, catching the sneering gaze of Hank near the front. Hank stood with his arms crossed, a physical barrier of defiance. "Elijah," Clara's voice cut through the noise. She stood near the courthouse door, her weathered face lined with worry. "They're waiting for you inside." He nodded but lingered for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the police car parked nearby. Daniels was leaning against the hood, arms folded, his expression as smug as ever. It wasn't lost on Elijah that Daniels had positioned himself as an enforcer, not of law, but of perception. The officer's presence was a quiet, oppressive reminder that Elijah's authority and credibility were constantly under siege. With a deep breath, Elijah ascended the steps, pushing through the courthouse doors and into the packed council chamber. The air inside was stifling, charged with the weight of expectation. He took his place at the front of the room, George beside him, papers clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Judge Hensley sat at the bench, her expression unreadable but stern. To her right sat the council members, their postures betraying a mix of skepticism and unease. Daniels entered moments later, taking a seat near the back. His presence loomed like a shadow. "We're here today," Hensley began, her voice echoing through the chamber, "to address new allegations regarding Barrett Industries and the proposed land development project. Mr. Barrett, you may begin." Elijah rose, his movements deliberate. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of his detractors before finally speaking. "Your Honor, council members and residents of Oakwood Springs," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I've come here today to address not just the allegations against my company, but the narrative that's been crafted about me and my intentions." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. "In the past weeks," Elijah continued, "I've faced baseless accusations, thinly veiled hostility, and outright attempts to discredit me. Not because of anything I've done, but because of who I am. Let's not mince words. This isn't about zoning laws or community standards. This is about control. It's about fear of change and fear of people like me stepping into spaces where we're not supposed to belong." A murmur rippled through the room, and Elijah saw Hank shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I understand change is hard," Elijah said, his voice rising slightly. "But progress doesn't come from clinging to the past. It comes from taking risks, from embracing new ideas and new people." "That's rich coming from a corporate suit," Hank interrupted, standing abruptly. "You talk about progress, but all you care about is lining your pockets." Elijah turned to face Hank, his gaze steady. "Is that what you think? That I'm here to take from this town? Let me tell you something, Hank. I've built my career on creating opportunities, not just for myself, but for communities that have been overlooked and undervalued. I'm here because I believe in the potential of this town, even if you don't." Hank opened his mouth to retort, but Judge Hensley banged her gavel sharply. "Mr. Dalton, you will remain seated." Hank sat back down, his face flushed with anger. Elijah took a deep breath before continuing. "But let's talk about what's really happening here. Because this isn't just about one person's opinion. It's about a system that's designed to keep people like me out." The room grew even quieter as Elijah turned toward Daniels, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Officer Daniels, you've been very vocal about your concerns regarding my presence in this town. Would you care to explain why?" Daniels smirked, but didn't respond. "Perhaps it's because you've made it your mission to undermine me at every turn," Elijah pressed. "From pulling me over without cause to fabricating reports about my company. You've gone out of your way to paint me as a threat. So tell me, officer, what exactly are you so afraid of?" Daniels finally stood, his smirk fading into a cold glare. "Watch your tone, Barrett," he said, his voice low but menacing. "You don't get to accuse me of anything without proof." "Oh, I have proof," Elijah said, his voice rising. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are the reports you filed against my company. Funny thing is, they're filled with errors, dates that don't match, allegations that don't hold up under scrutiny. And here's the kicker. One of the so-called complaints came from a resident who doesn't even live in this town anymore." The room erupted in whispers, and Daniels' face darkened. "And that's not all," Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. "I have testimony from multiple residents who've witnessed your harassment, not just of me, but of others who don't fit your mold of what this town should look like." Daniels stepped forward, his composure cracking. "You're making a lot of accusations without knowing what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Elijah shot back. "And I'm not afraid to call it out." "Order!" Judge Hensley banged her gavel again, her voice firm. "Officer Daniels, return to your seat." Daniels hesitated, his jaw tight, but he complied. Elijah turned back to the room, his tone softening but no less powerful. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about every person who's been told they don't belong, who's been judged before they've even had a chance to prove themselves. It's about dismantling a system that thrives on exclusion and fear." The room fell silent again, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. Even Hank looked subdued, his earlier bluster replaced by an uncertain frown. Judge Hensley cleared her throat, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Barrett. We will take your statements under advisement." As Elijah took his seat, George leaned over, his voice a whisper. "That was incredible. I think you might have just turned the tide." Elijah nodded, though his expression remained serious. This was only the beginning. He had spoken his truth, but the fight was far from over. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah stepped outside, the sunlight hitting his face like a spotlight. The crowd was still there, their energy subdued but not extinguished. Clara approached him, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "You made them listen." Elijah smiled faintly, but his focus was on the path ahead. This was more than a victory. It was a declaration, and he wasn't done fighting. From the edge of the crowd, Daniels watched, his face a mask of anger and resentment. Elijah could feel the weight of his gaze, a silent promise that this battle was far from over. But Elijah Barrett had faced bigger challenges before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The council chamber was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the courtroom clock. All eyes were fixed on Elijah Barrett, who stood at the podium with an air of quiet determination. The tension in the room was palpable, like the static charge before a storm. Across from him, Officer Daniels sat in his uniform, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as if he already knew how this would end. Elijah had faced men like Daniels before, men who used their authority as a weapon, who thrived on intimidation and control. But this time was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the community, about the systems that allowed people like Daniels to thrive unchecked. "Mr. Barrett," Judge Hensley's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. "You've made serious allegations against Officer Daniels. Do you have evidence to support your claims?" Elijah straightened, his voice steady but resonant. "I do, Your Honor." He gestured to George, who handed him a thick folder. Elijah opened it, revealing a collection of documents, statements, and transcripts. He held up the first sheet, addressing the room. "This is a formal complaint filed by a local resident 3 years ago," Elijah began, his voice carrying through the chamber. "It details a pattern of harassment and racial profiling by Officer Daniels. The complaint was dismissed without investigation." Daniels shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. Elijah continued, holding up another document. "This is a deposition from another resident, recounting a traffic stop where Officer Daniels used excessive force. The witness claims he was threatened into silence." The whispers in the room grew louder, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Elijah pressed on, his voice unyielding. "And these," he said, holding up a series of photos, "are images of reports Officer Daniels filed against me and my company. They're riddled with inconsistencies, false dates, fabricated details. One of the supposed complainants moved out of town years ago." Daniels stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice sharp with anger. "You're just trying to deflect because you can't defend your own actions." Elijah turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not the one under scrutiny here, officer. You are." Daniels stepped closer, his posture tense. "You don't belong here, Barrett. You think you can just waltz into this town and change everything? You don't understand what this place is about." Elijah took a step forward, meeting Daniels' glare. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "What this place is about isn't for you to decide. And I'm not going to let you, or anyone else, define my worth." The room was electric, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Judge Hensley banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the tension. "Order! Officer Daniels, return to your seat." Daniels hesitated, his jaw clenched, but he obeyed. Elijah turned back to the podium, his composure unshaken. "This isn't just about me," Elijah said, addressing the room once more. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to flourish. A system that punishes those who challenge the status quo. If we don't confront it, we're complicit in its perpetuation." He paused, scanning the faces in the room. Some were skeptical, others ashamed, but a few, like Clara, seated near the back, looked at him with quiet support. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Elijah continued. "I'm asking for fairness, for accountability, for a community that values integrity over fear." Judge Hensley leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Barrett, These are serious accusations. What are you proposing as a resolution? Elijah took a deep breath. An independent investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct, transparency in how complaints are handled, and a commitment to creating a town that welcomes progress instead of fearing it. The room erupted into murmurs, the council members exchanging uneasy glances. Daniels looked like he was ready to explode, his fists clenched against the table. "This is ridiculous," Daniels shouted, rising to his feet again. "This man doesn't care about this town. He's just trying to tear it apart." "No, officer," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I'm trying to make it better." Daniels took a step toward him, his face contorted with rage. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out physically, but Judge Hensley's gavel slammed down once more. "Officer Daniels, sit down," she commanded, her voice like thunder. Daniels froze, his defiance faltering under her glare. Slowly, he returned to his seat, but the damage was done. The room had seen his true colors, the raw anger and entitlement that lay beneath his veneer of authority. Judge Hensley turned back to Elijah, her gaze steady. "We'll take your proposal under advisement. This hearing is adjourned." She rose, signaling the end of the meeting. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as people began to file out. Elijah remained where he was, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps. The crowd had thinned, but a few reporters lingered, their cameras trained on Elijah as he emerged. "Elijah," Clara approached him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You were incredible in there. But this isn't over, is it?" Elijah shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No, Clara. It's just beginning." From across the street, Daniel stood by his patrol car, his face a mask of cold fury. Elijah met his gaze, refusing to look away. The message was clear. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something much bigger. The courthouse buzzed with energy as Elijah stepped outside. Though the air was cool and the sun dipped lower in the sky, a palpable warmth radiated from the crowd that had gathered. Gone were many of the jeering protesters, their voices replaced by murmurs of curiosity and cautious support. Elijah could feel the tide shifting, though he knew it wasn't complete. Not yet. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her face alight with quiet pride. Beside her was Brian, a young local business owner who had been one of the first to voice his support publicly. A few others joined them, their hesitant smiles and nods in acknowledgement of Elijah's courage. The cracks in the community's resistance were beginning to show, and through them, light filtered. "Elijah," Clara said as she approached him, "that was remarkable. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." "Thank you, Clara," Elijah replied, his voice heavy with both exhaustion and determination. "But this fight isn't over. Not by a long shot." Before Clara could respond, a commotion stirred near the courthouse steps. Officer Daniels had emerged, his jaw set and his shoulders squared as if trying to reclaim control of the narrative. But his once intimidating presence now seemed diminished. The allegations against him had been laid bare, and while his supporters might cling to denial, the cracks in his credibility were undeniable. Daniels moved toward Elijah, his steps deliberate. For a moment, the crowd tensed, unsure of what would happen. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mitchell, the deputy police chief, stepped into Daniels' path. "That's enough, Daniels," Mitchell said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Daniels glared at him, but Mitchell didn't waver. "You've caused enough trouble. It's time you face the consequences." "You're making a mistake," Daniels spat, his voice low but venomous. "No," Mitchell replied, his tone calm but resolute. "You made the mistake, and now you're going to answer for it." Two other officers stepped forward, their expressions neutral but professional. Daniels froze, his defiance faltering as the weight of the moment settled over him. He had played the game of power for years, but now the rules were changing. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Daniels was escorted away. Elijah felt a rush of emotions, vindication, relief, and a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about one man being held accountable. It was about a community beginning to confront its own prejudices, its own blind spots. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Hensley convened an emergency session with the council. The fallout from Danielle's exposure had cast doubt on the integrity of the local police force, and the council faced mounting pressure to act decisively. Elijah was invited to participate in the session as a key witness. Over the next several hours, Elijah presented his case with the same calm authority that had carried him through the earlier hearing. He outlined not only Danielle's misconduct, but also the systemic failures that had allowed it to persist. His words were direct but measured, his tone striking a balance between critique and hope. By the time the session ended, the council had agreed to a series of immediate actions: an independent investigation into the police department, a review of dismissed complaints, and the establishment of a community oversight board. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the council members filed out, Robert, the town planner who had initially been skeptical of Elijah, paused to shake his hand. "I underestimated you, Mr. Barrett," he admitted. "You're not just here to make a profit. You're here to make a difference." Elijah accepted the handshake, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Robert, but this isn't about me. It's about building something better for everyone." The next morning, Elijah stood on the porch of his temporary rental house, a cup of coffee in hand, as he watched the quiet street come to life. The events of the previous day still weighed on him, but there was also a sense of clarity. He had come to Oakwood Springs to finalize a land deal, but what he had found was a deeper purpose, a chance to challenge a broken system and lay the groundwork for something new. His phone buzzed on the porch railing, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant back at Barrett Industries. "Press inquiries are flooding in. Dozens of outlets want to cover the story. How do you want to handle it?" Elijah smiled faintly. The story had already started to spread, and he knew its impact would ripple far beyond Oakwood Springs. His fight had resonated with people who had faced similar battles, who had felt the sting of exclusion and the weight of systemic injustice. He typed a quick response: "Schedule a press conference for next week. Let's make sure the focus stays on the community and the changes being made." As he set the phone down, a knock at the door drew his attention. It was George, holding a folder and wearing an expression of cautious optimism. "Good morning," George said, stepping onto the porch. "I figured you'd want to see this." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the papers inside. It was an amended version of the development proposal, updated to include input from local businesses and community leaders. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting a collaborative approach that aligned with the town's values. "This is good work, George," Elijah said, nodding. "Let's move forward." George hesitated, then added, "You know, Elijah, I wasn't sure about you at first, but you've shown me, in this town, that you're not just here for yourself. You've got my respect." "Thank you, George," Elijah replied, his voice sincere. "But respect isn't the goal. Change is." In the weeks that followed, Oakwood Springs began to transform. The independent investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct within the police department, leading to several resignations and the implementation of new policies. The Community Oversight Board was established, its members a diverse group of residents committed to accountability and transparency. Elijah's development project was approved, but not without concessions. He worked closely with local leaders to ensure the project reflected the town's character and needs. Small businesses were given priority for contracts, and a percentage of profits was earmarked for community programs. The changes weren't easy, and resistance lingered among certain factions of the town. But Elijah saw progress in the small moments. A nod of acknowledgement from a former skeptic, a thank you note from a local family, the growing sense of unity at town meetings. Through it all, Elijah remained focused, his resolve stronger than ever. The battle had been hard-fought, but it had reaffirmed his belief in the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, as the sun set over Oakwood Springs, Elijah sat on a bench in the town square. The streets were quiet, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Clara joined him, her steps slow but steady. "You've done something remarkable here, Elijah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've given this town a chance to be better." Elijah smiled, his gaze on the horizon. "It's not about what I've done, Clara. It's about what we've started. And there's still so much work to do." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But you've shown us it's possible. That's what matters." As the sky turned shades of gold and pink, Elijah felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges wouldn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the community he had come to care about. The streets of Oakwood Springs were quiet now, the tension of the past weeks replaced with an uncertain calm. Change was settling over the town, not as a roaring tide, but as a steady, deliberate ripple. The council chamber's heated debates and courthouse showdowns were over, but their echoes lingered in every conversation, every glance exchanged on Main Street. People were beginning to reckon with what had happened. Not just the public humiliation of Officer Daniels, but the deeper truths about the systems that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. For Elijah Barrett, the journey had been transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. He came to Oakwood Springs expecting to close a deal, not to spark a reckoning. He had fought harder here than in some of the toughest boardrooms of his career, and yet the fight felt more meaningful. This wasn't just about numbers or profits. It was about people, about justice, about showing that resilience could dismantle even the most deeply rooted prejudices. Sitting on the porch of his rental house, Elijah reflected on how far he had come, not just in the past weeks, but over the course of his life. He thought about the lessons his father had taught him growing up on Chicago's South Side. Never let them define you. Never let them decide your worth. Those words had carried him through college, through the skepticism of professors who doubted his abilities, through the corporate world where his every success was scrutinized more than his peers. They had carried him through this battle too. But Oakwood Springs had taught him something new. The fight wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about creating space for others to rise, about challenging the systems that made such fights necessary in the first place. It was about taking the lessons he had learned in his life and using them to pave the way for others. This fight had tested his patience, his resilience, and his faith. There were moments he'd wanted to walk away, moments when the weight of it all felt like too much. But each time, he reminded himself of why he had started. Not just for himself, but for the people who couldn't stand where he stood, who didn't have the platform or the privilege to speak out. Oakwood Springs had changed him, just as he had begun to change it. The events in Oakwood Springs weren't unique. As Elijah drove through the quiet town, he saw reflections of it in every small community he had worked with over the years. The fear of change, the resistance to progress, the entrenched power structures. It was a story as old as time. But Oakwood Springs also reminded him of something else. Change was possible. The exposure of Officer Daniels was more than just a personal victory. It was a window into the systemic issues that had festered in the town for years. The council's agreement to an independent investigation and the establishment of a community oversight board were just the beginning. These steps sent a clear message. Accountability mattered, and silence was no longer an option. Elijah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change didn't come without resistance, and the forces that upheld the status quo would push back. But he also knew the power of collective action. Clara's courage, Brian's quiet support, Mitchell's intervention. These were the sparks that ignited a larger movement. They proved that while individuals could start change, it was the community that carried it forward. Elijah often thought about Dante, the teenager he had stepped in to defend during the confrontation on the courthouse steps. The fear in Dante's eyes that day haunted him, but it also fueled him. He saw in Dante a reflection of every young person who had been told they didn't belong, who had been made to feel small by a system designed to hold them back. That was why Elijah had fought so hard, not just for himself, but for people like Dante, people who deserve to walk through their communities without fear, to see their potential celebrated instead of questioned. His struggle in Oakwood Springs wasn't just about proving a point. It was about lighting a path for others to follow. As he prepared to leave the town and return to his corporate responsibilities, Elijah felt a profound sense of purpose. His development project had been approved, but it was no longer just a business endeavor. It was a promise to use his platform and resources to uplift the community, to ensure that Oakwood Springs could become a model of progress and inclusion. Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. For every step forward, there would be setbacks. Hank and others like him still harbored resentment, their mistrust simmering beneath the surface. But the cracks in their dominance had started to show. The Community Oversight Board was already holding its first meetings, and Elijah had committed to funding training programs for local businesses to promote equity and inclusion. He also planned to stay connected to Oakwood Springs, making regular visits to oversee the development project and check in with the community leaders who had supported him. Clara had joked that he was becoming a local celebrity, but Elijah brushed off the notion. He didn't care about recognition. What mattered was the impact. On his last night in Oakwood Springs, Elijah stood in the town square, the stars above him twinkling against the deep indigo sky. The square was quiet now, but he could still hear the echoes of the protests and the impassioned speeches that had taken place here. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time, and how much work remained. He pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, typing a single sentence. Progress begins when we refuse to accept the status quo. It was a simple thought, but it encapsulated everything he had learned here. Change didn't happen all at once. It was a series of small, deliberate actions, each one building on the last. And while Elijah was proud of what he had accomplished, he knew the fight would continue long after he was gone. Elijah hoped his story would resonate beyond Oakwood Springs. He hoped it would inspire others to stand up, to speak out, to challenge the systems that sought to silence them. He wanted people to see that resilience wasn't just about enduring, it was about transforming adversity into action. As he drove out of town the next morning, the sun rising over the horizon, Elijah felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, but it was one he was ready to walk. He wasn't just leaving Oakwood Springs with a victory. He was leaving it with a purpose. And that, he thought, was the greatest success of all. Elijah's story reminds us that systemic change is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for. It shows the power of resilience, community, and the courage to challenge injustice. While progress may be slow and imperfect, every step forward matters. And for those willing to stand up and lead the way, the impact can be transformative, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them.